In this video, we're going to talk about fiscal policy. Okay, and fiscal policy is one of the two tools we have to accomplish what's known as aggregate demand management. Okay, and it is by far the easiest one to think about. And the basic idea of aggregate demand management is that we are going to manage aggregate demand so that the economy is always in a long-run macro equilibrium. Okay, so remember the goal is this. Right, the goal is to have all three lines intersecting at the same point right there. Okay, but if we are, let's say, in a boom, okay, so if we're in a boom here, we need to somehow reduce production. And as we talked about last time, we know that the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. But another way we could do it is to somehow find a way to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. And so if we could do that, then we could do something like this, right? We would move along the short-run aggregate supply curve down to this point here. And we would again be at another long-run equilibrium, and it'd be just fine. The boom period would be over. Alternatively, if we find ourselves in a bust or a recession, what we could do is somehow find a way to boost aggregate demand and increase aggregate demand until we get to this long-run equilibrium. Okay, and so the point of fiscal policy is, or aggregate demand management, and fiscal policy is but one tool, is to move this aggregate demand curve such that we are in this sort of a model, right? If the output is too high, we reduce aggregate demand. If the output is too low, as it is here, then we increase aggregate demand to get us out of the recession. But how can we do that, right? How can we do that? How do we do it? What's the easiest way? Okay, and so the easiest way is to use fiscal policy. Okay, and so fiscal policy is the idea that we use the federal government budget to balance the economy. Okay, so if we want to do this, right, if we need to boost aggregate demand, right, if we need to increase aggregate demand, there's two ways we can do this, right? We can increase government spending, right, which will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, or we can reduce taxes. Okay? If we reduce taxes, that will leave more money in people's pockets and allow them to spend more of it on consumption. And so both of these will increase aggregate demand. You can think of this as the one way or one phrase way to word this is we can run deficits, right? By increasing government spending and not increasing taxes, right, we are running a deficit. At the same time, by reducing taxes and not decreasing government spending, we are running a deficit. And so this is the standard logic that people like Paul Krugman will use. And they'll say that, this might be the time for the US government to run a deficit, right? And this is what they're saying. We need to either increase government spending or reduce taxes. Now, most of the time, we just increase government spending because reducing taxes isn't as clear that it will work, but increasing government spending, at least at a theoretical level, works much more clearly, much more unambiguously. Okay, and we call this expansionary fiscal policy, right? Expansionary because it's designed to increase aggregate demand, and fiscal policy because it's using the federal government's budget. Okay. On the other side, we can go the other way, right? So let's say that we are here. Okay. Okay, so if we're here, right, there's two ways that we can solve this, right? We need to reduce output, and the two ways are we can decrease government spending, or we can increase taxes. Okay, so here, by decreasing government spending, we will reduce aggregate demand because there will be less spending going on. At the same time, if we increase taxes, that takes more money out of people's paychecks and results in them consuming less. And so both of these will reduce aggregate demand. And just like above, we can say this is tantamount to running a surplus. Right? So in boom periods, we want to run a surplus, and in bust periods, we want to run deficits, right? And we call these things contractionary fiscal policy, right? Contractionary because it's designed to reduce aggregate demand, and again, fiscal policy because we're using the federal government's budget. Now, an interesting question that we could ask, that lots of scholars ask all the time, is do we have to worry about balancing the budget? Right? And in this model, the answer is no, right? In the model. Right? And the reason is because if you think about it, during the good times, during the boom periods, we'll run a surplus, and during the bad times, we'll spend that surplus, right? And so we're saving money here, and we're spending money there, right? We save money here, we spend money there. And over the course of the entire business cycle, right, if this is the business cycle, if it looks somewhat like that, right, this would be saving, spending, saving, spending, right? And what this is saying is that the periods up are going to be equal to the periods down, up, down, right, in a sufficiently long amount of time, okay? And so in the end, right, by the end of time, essentially, the idea is that the booms and the busts will wash out, right? The spending that we have to do will be financed by the savings that we do during the good times, right? Now, one problem with this is the nature of political realities. Okay, but that's a topic for perhaps the end of the semester or a different class called public choice theory. Okay, so if you have a public choice class, I would highly recommend taking it and examining sort of this phenomenon, whether or not the balanced budget worry or lack thereof is valid. Okay, and so let's do some practice with this. Okay, so let's say that we are here. Okay. Don't need that. Okay, so let's say we're here, and let's say that consumers all of a sudden decide that what they want to do is save money for retirement, right? They start to be worried about retirement. They may be worried about their job lasting until they retire, and so they start to save more money, okay? How do we illustrate this? Okay, well first, right, we would say that aggregate demand would shift to the left, and that would cause the bust, the very bust or recession that people were worried about. Okay, and so the bust happens because people get scared about the future. They start to save money for retirement or for rainy day, or God forbid they lose their job. Okay, and so as we described, there's one way to solve this. Okay, if we wait long enough, the long run will kick in, which means that we can renegotiate contracts, okay, and the short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right as people start accepting lower wages or as the price of steel and other input goods falls, right, once those contracts get renegotiated. Okay, so one way, the automatic adjustment mechanism, is to allow the short run aggregate supply to shift to the right and get us down to here. Okay, but there's another way we can do it. The other way we can do it is by using aggregate demand management. Okay, so what do we have to do? Well, we've got to find a way to shift the aggregate demand curve back to the right. And the way we can do this is by either increasing government spending, right, which would boost aggregate demand back to the right, or we can lower taxes, right? And if we do either one of those or both of them, essentially just running a surplus, we'll boost aggregate demand back to the right from 82 to 81. Okay, this is sort of the aggregate demand management approach. Okay, we basically want to move aggregate demand by using government policy to end a recession in this case. Okay, let's do another example. Let's say that instead of being in a bust, we enter into a boom. Okay, so let's say workers all of a sudden feel very confident about the future, right? They say like, oh man, everything's going great. We're just going to start spending money left and right because we can afford to do that because the future is looking great. Okay, so consumers are very confident. They start buying more product. This in turn increases aggregate demand. Output rises in the short run from Y1 to Y2. Okay? Now, again, we can fix this through the automatic adjustment mechanism, or rather, this can be fixed through the automatic adjustment mechanism by allowing wages to rise and the price of inputs to rise, which would shift short-run aggregate supply to the left. Okay, but we're going to do the aggregate demand management approach, and here we want to either decrease government spending or increase taxes. Essentially, here in this scenario, we want to run a surplus, okay? And that would reduce aggregate demand and shift it over to the left, okay? Now, the important thing to consider in all of this, okay, so I'll put this up here. The important thing to consider is that we want to end business cycles quickly, right? We don't want to be in a recession for very long, but we also don't want to be in a boom for very long either, okay? So the goal is to reduce the business cycle, to get us back to this long run equilibrium or this long run equilibrium as quickly as we can, okay? And so what we need to do is pick the method that will get us there to long run equilibrium fastest. Okay? If the automatic adjustment mechanism turns out to be the fastest way to get us back to a long run equilibrium, right? Then we should let the automatic adjustment mechanism do its work. But if it turns out that using fiscal policy is the fastest way to do it, then we should use fiscal policy and do it right away. Okay? And so the point here is that right now at least, there's two different ways for us to get from here to a long run equilibrium. Either one will work. Okay? We can let the automatic adjustment mechanism do it, or we can do it actively by through aggregate demand management. And the point here is to pick the one that will actually get it done fastest. Okay? All right. I will put up some more links in Blackboard for you to go look at, and I will see you guys next week.